You built it yourself, cut the parts from the sprues with a hobby knife. You sanded the edges smooth, glued the chassis together, and waited overnight for it to dry. Then soldered the motor wires to the speed controller. You painted the body, 3 coats, each one thinner than the last, each one drying for 24 hours before the next. And when it was done, when every screw was tight, and every wire was in place, and every decal was straight, you set it on the ground, and you pressed the trigger, and it moved. And the sound it made, and the way it rolled, and the dirt it kicked up behind the rear tires meant more to you than any toy you ever pulled out of a box. This was a machine you made, and it was a Tamiya. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you are watching from. Before you touched a single part, the box stopped you, because Tamiya box art was not a photograph. It was a painting. A full-color, hand-painted illustration of a tank rolling through a muddy battlefield, or a race car drifting through a turn, or a fighter plane banking against a clouded sky. The painting was so detailed, so alive, so perfectly composed that you could have framed it and hung it on your wall. Many boys did. They cut the top off the box and pinned it above their desk because throwing away a Tamiya box top felt like throwing away a piece of art. You opened the box and the smell hit you. Polystyrene, that specific, sharp, slightly sweet plastic smell that meant model, building the way the smell of fresh cut grass meant summer, or the smell of gasoline meant your father's garage. You never forgot that smell. You are smelling it right now just reading this. Inside, sprues, gray or olive drab or tan plastic trees with dozens of parts still attached. Each one numbered, each one waiting to be freed with a hobby knife and cleaned up with a small file. An instruction sheet, not a pamphlet, a book. 12, 20, sometimes 30 pages of step-by-step diagrams that assumed you were smart enough to follow them and patient enough to not skip ahead. A sheet of decals, thin, delicate water transfer decals that you soaked in warm water and slid into place with a wet finger and that wrinkled if you breathed on them wrong. Tamiya did not make easy kits. They made precise kits. The parts fit together with a tolerance that other companies could not match. Revel parts had gaps. Monogram parts had flash, thin ridges of excess plastic along the seam lines that you had to scrape off with a knife. Tamiya parts clicked together like they were made for each other, because they were. The molds were machined to a standard that the model industry had never seen before, and the result was a kit that built into something that looked real. Not like a toy, not like a model, like a miniature version of the actual thing, scaled down to 1/35 of its original size, accurate to the rivet. The military models were the beginning. Tamiya started with a Panther tank in the early 1960s, and the reason they chose a tank was pure engineering. The linear shape of a tank made the mold simple to produce, and the body was just large enough to hold a small electric motor and 2 AA batteries. That first Panther could move. You built it, you dropped in the batteries, you flipped the switch, and the tank crawled across the kitchen table with its rubber treads grinding and its turret fixed in place, and you were not sitting in a kitchen in Ohio or Texas or New Jersey anymore. You were in Normandy, you were in Kursk, you were in the Ardennes, you were wherever the instruction sheet said the tank had fought because you had read the history section on the first page. Tamiya always included a history section, and now the war was on your kitchen table and you were in command. They made Tigers and Shermans and Panzers and half-tracks and Jeeps and soldiers and medics and officers and barbed wire and sandbags and brick walls and road signs. You could build an entire battlefield on a sheet of plywood. Some boys did. They spent months, not hours, months creating dioramas with hills made from plaster and trees made from wire and lichen and roads made from textured paint. The diorama sat on a table in the corner of their bedroom, and it grew every week as new Tamiya kits were added and new details were painted and new scenarios were imagined. It was not a hobby, it was a world. And then Tamiya did something that changed everything. In 1976, they released a radio-controlled Porsche 934, a kit that you assembled yourself and then drove with a handheld transmitter. Not a slot car locked to a track, not a tethered car running in circles. A free car that went where you pointed it, across grass and dirt and pavement and your neighbor's lawn if you were not careful with the steering trim. The RC car revolution had begun, and Tamiya was at the center of it. The Rough Rider came in 1979, the first of Tamiya's SRB series special racing buggies, and it changed the meaning of the word toy for an entire generation of boys. The Rough Rider was not a toy, it was a vehicle. It had a fiberglass chassis, it had oil-filled shock absorbers, it had a rear suspension with torsion bars, it had a motor that screamed at 12,000 RPM and drove the rear wheels through a gear train that you assembled yourself from parts that came in a bag and that took 4 hours to get right. You did not buy a Rough Rider the way you bought a Hot Wheels car. You earned a Rough Rider. You saved your allowance for months. You mowed lawns. You washed cars. You negotiated with your parents. And when you finally had enough $60, $70, $80, depending on the year and the hobby shop, you carried the box home like it was a religious artifact, and you cleared the kitchen table and you began. The Sand Scorcher was next. A Volkswagen Baja Bug with a body so detailed it looked like a real car that had been shrunk in a science fiction movie. Then the Grasshopper, the entry-level buggy that every kid could afford and that taught a generation how to build, drive, crash, fix, and build again. Then the Hornet, the Frog, the Fox, the Hotshot, the first four-wheel drive Tamiya, the car that made every other RC car on the track look like a toy. And the Avante, the Pinnacle, the car that collectors now pay $900 for in the original box. Every one of them was a KT, not a finished product, a kit, a box full of parts, and a book full of instructions and a weekend full of work. You built it. You started with the chassis, the plate that everything else attached to. You mounted the motor, you wired the speed controller, you soldered the connections, and the first time you soldered a Tamiya kit, you burned your finger, and the second time you burned your finger again, and the third time you held the iron at the right angle for long enough to make a clean joint, and the solder flowed like liquid silver into the connection, and you felt like an engineer. You assembled the gear train. This was the part that separated the patient from the impatient. The gears had to mesh perfectly. Too tight and they would grind and strip. Too loose and they would skip and lose power. You adjusted them by ear, listening for the hum that meant the gears were meshing correctly, not grinding, not whining, just humming. That hum was the sound of precision. The sound of getting it right, the sound of everything working the way the instruction book said it would if you followed the steps and did not skip ahead. You assembled the suspension, oil-filled shocks that you filled with actual silicone oil from a tiny bottle, and if you overfilled them, they leaked, and if you underfilled them, they bounced, and finding the right level was an art that nobody could teach you. Because it depended on your car and your track and your driving style and the weight of the body you put on top. You painted the body. This was the part that took the longest and mattered the most because the body was what everyone saw. 3 coats of white primer from a Tamiya spray can, each one dried for 24 hours. Then the masking, strips of tape laid carefully along the lines where one color ended and another began, pressed down with a fingernail to prevent bleed. Then 2 coats of blue or red or orange dried overnight, then the pinstripe that you did by hand with a brush that had 3 hairs on it, and the pinstripe wavered a little because your hand was not perfectly steady and you were 14 years old, and the waver became part of the car's character. Your car, your waver, your imperfection that made it perfect because it was yours. You got paint on your fingers, on your jeans, on the newspaper on the garage floor itself. Your mother said something about the garage floor, and you said you would clean it up, and you did not clean it up, and the paint stain is still there 30 years later if the house has not been sold. And then the moment. Everything you had done, the cutting, the gluing, the soldering, the painting, the waiting, the adjusting, all of it was for this. You carried the car outside. You set it on the driveway. Your friend was there, the neighbor kid was there, everyone wanted to see if it worked. Because it might not. You might have wired the motor backwards. You might have stripped a gear. That was always a possibility. And that possibility is what made the moment you pulled the trigger and the wheels spun and the car lurched forward and shot down the driveway. That possibility is what made it feel like every Christmas morning compressed into 1 second. You drove it into the curb on the first run. You drove it into the mailbox on the second. You drove it through a puddle and the electronics shorted and it stopped and you had to take it apart and dry everything with a hairdryer. You broke the front bumper on day 1. You stripped the spur gear on day 2. And on day 3, you went back to the hobby shop and bought replacement parts and the man behind the counter said, "Let me guess, The steering rod, and you nodded because he had seen 1,000 boys break the same part on the same car in the same week. And you went home and fixed it and drove it again and broke something else and fixed that too. That was the cycle. Build, drive, break, fix. Build better, drive faster, break harder, fix smarter. It was not a hobby, it was an education. And every broken part taught you something that a classroom never could. The hobby shop was where it happened. Every Saturday morning, not online, not Amazon, a physical store on a strip mall or a side street with a bell on the door that rang when you walked in, and a man behind the counter who knew your name and your car and what part you needed before you told him. The shelves were stacked with Tamiya boxes, kits, motors, tires, shocks, bearings, pinion gears, spur gears, body shells, paint, decals, and tools. You could spend an hour in that store and buy one $9 part, and the man behind the counter did not rush you because he understood that the hour was the point. The buying was the excuse. The being there among the boxes and the parts and the other builders who were also there on a Saturday morning because they had nowhere better to be, that was the hobby. Those shops are gone now. Not all of them, but most of them. The bell on the door is silent. The man behind the counter retired or moved on. The shelves that held Tamiya boxes hold nothing. The strip mall is a nail salon or a vape shop or an empty storefront with a for-lease sign in the window. The man who built all of this, the man whose family name was on every box, was Shunsaku Tamiya, the son of the founder, the chairman. The man who personally photographed full-size tanks and aircraft and automobiles and then demanded that his modelers reproduce every bolt, every weld seam, every scratch on the paint of the real machine in miniature. He was obsessed with accuracy. So obsessed that during the Cold War, the Japanese police placed him under surveillance because Shunsaku Tamiya had been visiting the Soviet embassy in Tokyo. He was not spying. He was not selling secrets. He was photographing Warsaw Pact tanks, T-72s, BMPs, and BTRs because his model line needed to be accurate. And the only place in Japan where you could see a real Soviet tank was the embassy parking lot. The police watched him for months before they understood. This man was not a threat to national security. He was a model builder who refused to guess what a rivet looked like when he could photograph the real thing. Shunsaku Tamiya died on July 18, 2025. He was 90 years old. He had spent his entire life making kits that taught boys how to build, how to paint, how to read instructions, how to be patient, how to fail, how to fix, and how to hold something in their hands that they had made from nothing and feel pride that no store-bought toy could ever deliver. And the thing he feared most has happened. The culture he built is dying. Not the company. The company is fine. The company still makes kits. The company still makes paint. The company still makes the best 1/35th scale military models in the world. The company survived. The culture did not. Today, you can buy an RC car that is ready to drive out of the box, ready to run. RTR. 3 letters that killed a generation of builders. No building, no soldering, no painting, no adjusting, no Saturday mornings at the hobby shop debating which motor to buy, no 4-hour gear train assembly on the kitchen table, no 3-coat paint job in the garage with 24 hours between each coat, no listening for the hum, no burned fingers, no paint on the jeans, no waver in the pinstripe, no pride. You open the box, you charge the battery, you drive. It is faster than anything Tamiya ever made in 1985. It is more durable, it is cheaper, it handles better on a track, and it is worth exactly as much as the time you spent building it, which is 0, because you did not build it. Someone in a factory built it. And the thing that made a Tamiya yours, the hours, the patience, the mistakes, the fixes, the paint, the solder, the hum, that thing is not in the box. The children of today will never know what it feels like to spend 4 Saturdays building something that crashes on the first run and breaks the front suspension arm and sends you back to the hobby shop for a $7 replacement part and then back to the kitchen table for another 2 hours of repair work that teaches you more about engineering than any classroom ever will. They will never know because they do not have to. Ready to run is better. Ready to run is easier, ready to run is faster, and ready to run is the reason that the hobby shops closed and the kitchen tables are clean and the garages have no paint stains on the floor and the soldering irons are in the junk drawer and the boys who built machines with their hands are men who buy machines from Amazon with their credit cards. The Tamiya kits are still on the shelves. You can still buy a Grasshopper, you can still buy a Hornet, you can still buy military models in 1/35th scale with instruction books that assume you are smart and patient and willing to spend a Saturday afternoon with a hobby knife and a bottle of cement. The products are alive, the company is alive. But the culture, the Saturday mornings, the hobby shops, the kitchen tables covered in newspaper and paint cans and sprues, the 4 hours with a soldering iron, the 3 coats of white with 24 hours between each one, that culture is as dead as the hobby shops that sustained it. A man on eBay bought a vintage Tamiya Falcon for $200. He wrote a review. One of the first RC cars growing up. I was about 15 years old and it was my cousin's RC car. I was hooked from that point on. My family all have went on to become successful policemen, doctors, and engineers. The funny thing is we all still remember our old RC cars. Money can't buy time, but it can buy my old RC of my childhood. Money cannot buy time, but it can buy the box. The box with the painting on the front. The box that smells like polystyrene when you open it. The box that contains 100 parts on gray sprues and an instruction book and a sheet of decals and the promise that if you are patient enough and careful enough and willing to spend 4 hours on a Saturday afternoon with a hobby knife and a soldering iron and a can of paint, you will build something that moves, something that is yours, something that nobody gave you and nobody can take away from you because you made it with your own hands in a kitchen that smelled like glue and sounded like concentration and felt like the best afternoon of your life. Shunsaku Tamiya is gone. The hobby shops are closing, the ready-to-run cars are winning, but the box is still on the shelf. And the boy who built his first Tamiya on a kitchen table in 1982 is sitting here right now remembering the hum of the gears and the smell of the paint and the moment he set it on the ground and pressed the trigger and it moved. It moved because he built it. And nothing you can buy in a box will ever feel like that.